This week on Act Out, a close-up look at the epicenter of the nation's affordable housing crisis, San Francisco. We sit down with local residents and activists to hear about the manifold problems that gave rise to this crisis and the creative ways in which folks are fighting for their human rights. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. In the nationwide fight for the basic right of housing, San Francisco shines like a beacon of capitalism, a prime example of the clash between profit and public good, bottom lines and human rights. Much-deserved blame gets laid at the feet of tech companies who, with the help of tax breaks and loopholes, pushed San Francisco to the top of the list for billionaires. Indeed, 1 out of every 12,000 residents in San Francisco is a billionaire, more than anywhere else in the world. Still though, as satisfying as it may feel, we can't blame the techies for everything. After all, they wouldn't have been able to build an empire of income inequality and robot dogs if there wasn't already some fuckery at play. Way back in the 1880s, San Francisco started with housing restrictions that targeted Chinese immigrants. In the first half of the 20th century, both zoning laws and landowner requirements continued to target Asian and Black families. Not to mention the forced eviction of Japanese families during World War II, when they were, forced to go live in concentration camps. Oh, but wait, we don't have those, do we? Anyway, known as the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions sections in a home's title report, some of this verbiage can still be found in housing contracts today, an unenforceable echo of the not-so-distant past. One such contract reads, "No person of any race other than the Caucasian or white race may use or occupy the property, with the exception of domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant." Residents of African, Mongolian, or Japanese descent were also frequently targeted and mentioned outright in contracts. After the Second World War, San Francisco got to work on cleaning up areas of blight, which, as noted by the Planning Commission's Centennial Report, is a deeply political term firmly rooted in structural racism, which relied on fears of white flight and urban disinvestment to justify the wholesale removal of communities of color, which is exactly what happened. In one example, in the Fillmore district, some 883 businesses and 4,729 households were forced out. Meanwhile, wealthier and white neighborhoods were zoned for single-family homes and remain that way today. Of course, as rents and housing prices continue to rise, even a snazzy techie can't necessarily afford an entire house. So they look to, for instance, the Mission District, the historically Latinx neighborhood where they can push out a family that's lived there for decades and, have enough left over to turn that extra bedroom into an office. For their part, real estate developers have been only too happy to use a varied bag of tricks to evict low-income renters. The Ellis Act is a crackerjack piece of legislation that allows landlords to evict tenants when they want to get out of the business of renting. But far from being used as an epiphany career shift, Ellis Act evictions have happened by the thousands in order to get rid of renters and turn prime real estate into condos, thereby avoiding the rental business and making bank off the selling business. Sometimes Ellis Act evictions are also used to turn a multifamily unit into a mansion because, we need more of those. Just take a look at this map. Each one of those dots is an eviction. Each one of the red dots is an Ellis Act eviction. Legislatively, economically, systemically, the problems that have created San Francisco's affordable housing crisis are many. And on the ground, folks are not only combating these problems, but looking for solutions. Creative solutions that strike down the for-profit propaganda soaking airwaves and corporate media. For instance, that trope that it's an issue of supply, when there are some 30,000 plus vacant units in San Francisco already, a statistic that reminds me of the fact that there are some 6 homes vacant for every homeless person in the US. But the promise of building homes makes land developers and real estate bigwigs salivate, so they push this narrative while ignoring the cornerstone of this crisis, affordability. So this week, we take an in-depth look at the affordable housing crisis in San Francisco by sitting down with the folks on the front lines.
Gentrification is deep in that it's not just that you get pushed out, right? The other side of it is just that you're excluded from what has come in. And that's incredibly painful because there's a lot of families that can't afford the businesses that come in and just feel out of place.
The effort to rezone those neighborhoods and kind of repurpose our industrial areas of the city got completely hijacked by the city process and aced out working people out of the conversation and basically created an environment for developers to be able to transition formerly industrial areas of the city, large sites that used to support blue-collar jobs into basically being Class A high-rise office space and high-end housing. So you end up with all these really expensive building types and attraction of tech workers to replace blue-collar jobs. And so it kind of transformed the entire San Francisco economy from a job base where people could actually, there were more jobs per square foot, number one, in the old industrial uses. And with the less jobs and higher paying jobs, people, lower income people of color got pushed out of the city in terms of their employment prospects. And then the new housing that got built was in high-rise condos or big multi-unit buildings, expensive type of housing that people can't afford. After the recession and with the bailout of the banks and everything, kind of this globalization of financialization of housing, you see this kind of global interest in San Francisco as an investment opportunity. And all the powers in San Francisco welcomed that. So the transition to like tech jobs, the transition to this global capitalization and commodification of housing has completely wiped out any diversity in who can afford to live here anymore. There are so many people who have bought completely into this kind of supply side economics, this whole theory of trickle down. You mentioned that there are tens of thousands of units that are vacant in the city currently. So the latest census data shows 30,000 units. There have been some presentations to the Planning Commission that say maybe it's more like 40,000 units. Plus, we know that there's at least 40,000 units that are already entitled to be built, meaning that they've already been approved to be built. But the mainstream media here and developers keep complaining that every time a community questions how much affordable housing is being provided, either on public lands or by a private developer, that somehow communities are obstacles to this kind of holy grail of supply that we need to be providing. And somehow we're creating, or communities are creating, the very problem that communities are trying to solve.
I recently read that there are some like 30,000 empty units in San Francisco. So it's really not a supply issue.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. If it was a supply issue, I think we would have worked our way out of this a while ago. I mean, in fact, not to get super wonky, and sorry if I'm going to do that, but the last 3 years, if you look at what the city and county of San Francisco has built, we have hit 215% of our target for market rate housing. 215%. We have only hit 68% of our target for affordable housing. So the question becomes is, why is it that we're building market rate housing, voluminous market rate housing, but like the Biz Times today said, we're still the most expensive city in the country to live. If it was a supply and demand thing, things would be dramatically different. And that's not to say that I'm opposed to development. I think development is important, but it's how you develop and ensuring that you're taking the most marginalized and including them in the change that will come, not just pushing them out of the way and saying, well, you know what, you're poor, so sorry, tough luck.
One of the things that we see that's very clever, and it's kind of expanded through kind of this spread of neoliberalism, which is where you make sure that you use words like crisis. We're in a housing crisis, right? And so people start to respond in an immediate way. They don't see a system. They get confused about what what they're being told because they're thinking that they're in a crisis. They know that they personally are in a crisis, and then we need to solve that crisis with something really simple. What can I understand? And so what they're fed is it's supply. We need to deregulate land. And this is another neoliberal concept, right? We need to deregulate industry. And so developers will come in, they're going to build supply to solve our housing crisis. It's all kind of classic stuff. And the other aspect of it is that you use the mainstream media to keep saying the same thing over and over and over again. And it's a very crafty strategy to make sure that then people start to support policies that respond to what they've heard over and over and over again. For us to be able to have our own media that we create, that communities then can use to understand an issue and to understand systems, not just I can't afford my housing, so what do I do? But actually understanding the system so that when they go to City Hall to talk about something or to work on legislation to start to change the narrative or to start to change the way that we do housing policy is the most powerful thing that we can do.
The assumption is that it is a supply side challenge that we're facing in order to meet our housing needs, but in fact, we're experiencing massive displacement, for many of our low-income working class communities throughout the city, and that massive displacement primarily comes from speculative efforts on behalf of, large-scale landlords and developers and property owners that really see housing and the housing stock as a way to maximize their profits, and oftentimes really wielding kind of excessive profits at the expense of ensuring kind of long-term, stable, healthy housing, for San Francisco residents. And so, if the issue there is speculation that's causing massive displacement, then our interventions need to focus on that issue and not necessarily on the fact that there's an undersupply of housing overall. So what that looks like are the kinds of tenant protections that would prevent landlords from engaging in speculation and engaging in unjust evictions that would cause a lot of displacement. And then similarly, if we also have housing that is primarily priced at the highest income earners, that means by definition that we don't have housing that's priced at the wages that everyday people make in our neighborhoods, in our communities. And so what are the policies and rule changes that can be enacted in order to make sure that housing is actually priced at levels that are affordable to the wages that people are making, whether they are working in, as cooks in the restaurants kind of on Main Street, where they're working as teachers in our local schools, where they're working, in nonprofit community-based organizations, all of whom are contributing to the health and vitality of the city, but yet are priced out from housing in the city.
So any development that's going to be over 10 units in San Francisco is required by law to either include what is an inclusionary requirement of housing, which is a certain percentage of housing that is below market rate, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's affordable. Or they can opt to pay a fee so that money goes into a fund for below market rate housing at some other time and place. So it's, the bare minimum kind of requirement from the city for any development to produce a certain percentage of below market rate housing. And then again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be affordable to the people in that particular neighborhood. Below market rate could be a few $100s below what market rate is. And even that percentage of housing that is designated for below market rate housing is allocated to a pretty broad spectrum of what is categorized by average median income, which can go really high. It could be essentially subsidized housing for people making, over $100,000 a year.
There's such a gap between what people actually make and what the market rate for housing is, that even if something's below market rate, most people can't afford it. And when people talk in communities, they know that they can't afford it. And so what happens is people start to ask, what's affordable housing? I don't even know anymore. because I try to get into a tax credit unit and they tell me I make too little. And then I try to get in a below market rate unit and they tell me I make too little. And then I try to get into public housing and they tell me I make too much. And then it's like everybody's kind of confused of like, why am I getting left out? You know, I don't qualify for anything, and they're on waiting lists for years. And so this kind of promise or this complaint from developers that they're, you know, providing 15% of the units being affordable, and then they're trying to get public support for the developments, they can get it. But the problem is that our politicians are listening to the plight of the developers again, rather than understanding what communities actually need.
I always say this, I don't just want to be an outdoor museum. Like, I don't want facadism. I don't just want the murals and, you know, the pretty colors and the taquerias. I want the people that patron those to live here and be here. I want the people that create the murals to live here and be here. And I want the people that are coming in to not just want the culture and forget the people. You need to understand that we do have a history here and that we want to be here. And I think that that's a fair thing to ask. Calle 24 started as a lower 24th Street Merchants Association, mainly because we, you know, have to kind of acknowledge history is that we are a red line community historically. And a lot of the privileges that were afforded Valencia Street, 24th and up, were not afforded down here, where predominantly immigrant first generation owned businesses, and there was a disparity. So Eric Arguello, John Mendoza, Miguel Bustos, all started the lower 24th Street Merchants Association, which was an attempt to try to strengthen and give support to local businesses by, you know, kind of bringing political power into the neighborhood. And in around 2013, 2014, the conversation shifted with former Supervisor David Campos for this district in creating something like a cultural district, something similar to Chinatown, but with a special use district being enacted and some kind of like legitimate legal boundaries for ourselves. And so in 2014, a resolution was introduced to make that a reality. And so we now have a Latino cultural district from Cesar Chavez to about 22nd and from Bartlett down to Potrero, where this council, who's elected by the members of the community, helps kind of create different either design guidelines or does advocacy, or now has a staff and an office that helps really revitalize the Latino community and push the narrative that we exist here and we've had a history here.
We see the movement for community self-determination. It's really actualized in community planning processes that are really lifting up the voices of young people, tenants, first, second generation immigrant community members that are often excluded from institutional planning processes as a way to express and to fight for environmental justice. In San Francisco, we're also a sanctuary city, and we often define that as define it in a limited way, in that San Francisco isn't collaborating with federal immigration officials to implement any sort of immigration policy, but with an environmental justice view, we really see that as, if we're a sanctuary city, how are we ensuring and guaranteeing basic human rights, everything from shelter to education, to civic engagement, to employment, to everyone who makes their home in San Francisco, regardless of their status and how they got here. And so we really see that fight for environmental justice is very linked to a housing rights approach.
There's a vibrant alliance of different organizations that are connected to and represent those different ethnic communities here in the Excelsior. This neighborhood has 52% foreign-born population, with lots of Chinese community members, Latinx community members, different Asian communities as well. And it's been really significant and powerful to have those different organizations sort of converge and really take the movement building approach, right? Where it's not a single issue for any particular organizing, but really recognizing kind of those shared struggles around those working class communities. It's a challenge logistically, but meetings happen, in English, and then in Spanish, and then in Tagalog, and then in Cantonese, and not always every time, but as much as possible, really wanting to cater to having that sort of mix of folks and convergence of experiences. That diversity is strength, right? And that unity across this really kind of beautiful, diverse, but vulnerable community is really what's going to be necessary to make the difference, to make sure that the development is in the interest of folks who are deeply rooted, but also highly vulnerable.
Communities are leading with a vision for, what does healthy, equitable development look like, in a way that we're really meeting people's needs for shelter and for environmental justice. And it's really with community organizing and building power in order to hold these larger institutions more accountable and our decision makers accountable, that we hope to change this conversation. Really kind of putting the voices and the stories of community members kind of at the front of this conversation. There are very kind of high profile kind of development fights that are happening, but there's also a larger campaign that has been building around this question of how are we ensuring that our public tax dollars are coming back to be reinvested in our community needs instead of being held hostage by Wall Street banks that are defining the terms of how housing is financed. And that is a kind of very exciting efforts that are happening locally throughout the state, but also in our neighborhoods in order to move forward to creating a publicly chartered bank that will then reinvest the people's dollars into the people's needs.
There's been a lot of robust surveying, in-depth surveying of the kind of multicultural, multilingual community that exists here in the Excelsior to identify what are the challenges, what are the barriers, and what are the priorities for people in the neighborhood, and to really build a platform and build a vision based on things that people in the neighborhood are identifying. And to challenge this kind of narrative or some of the tactics around people and working class communities being against development. And that's not the case at all. People want, there's this document that we put together that's a comprehensive sort of holistic vision for what equitable development might look like. And it's titled Better Neighborhoods, Same Neighbors. And so people are hungry for that investment and that development, but not for it to be sort of another kind of step in the history of kind of exclusive, disenfranchising investment that we've inherited, but to be an investment that's going to create stability for working class communities that have been waiting on that investment for a long time, but are so often shut out.
Another strategy we focused on a lot was called the small site acquisition program, where when an apartment building comes up for sale, that we make sure the nonprofit organizations are in line to buy those properties, literally just taking them off of the speculative market. So block by block, the more that we can buy and take off the market, hopefully we can stabilize communities and kind of head off a bit of the escalation of property values that happens when you have comparable sales that keep kind of pushing the value of the price of housing up. And then we just passed actually a law that was kind of fashioned after a law in Washington, D.C. called the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. It just passed it's like a couple of months ago, and we're still working on implementation, which would give nonprofit organizations kind of first right of refusal or kind of a prioritized negotiating position to be able to buy these apartment buildings. So kind of anti-displacement measures, making sure tenants know their rights, and then making sure that we're buying apartment buildings to take them off of the market. The last thing is making sure that we're expanding our tenant organizing so that it's at least statewide, because a lot of the laws that constrain tenants' rights are at the state level, and then also organizing nationally so that as we're passing laws in various jurisdictions and various states, that we model laws. Like we got some great tenants' rights passed in Oregon and New York recently, and now we're trying to model some changes to tenants' rights legislation here in California, kind of modeled after those.
There's no question in my mind that capitalism is deeply flawed. And even when you take yourself out of where we live immediately, you can see the flaws in the third world because we have all we have because we've taken all we've taken. And so my mind state is always kind of around that. But for me, it's what is relative to now and here. If we do it right and we leverage, we can take those resources and give back to the people that have the very least. But I think it's being creative. And if our local elected officials don't want to work with us, and they by and large right now do, it's finding other ways to do it. So I'll make a plug for something that we're working on at Todco Group, which is the nonprofit that I work at. We're an affordable housing developer and one of the oldest advocacy organizations around land use. And so March 2020, we're pushing a ballot measure called the Balanced Development Act of San Francisco that says if the city and county of San Francisco wants to give out office space for new big office towers to be built, which they give out about 1 million square feet a year, if you want to do that, then, and you want to give out that full million, then you're going to have to develop 100% of your affordable housing target goals. And if not, for example, the number I gave you, 68% is what we're hitting right now, then that means that office allocation will drop by 32% and will continue to go down as low as you want to go. And so this is a kind of creative solution to put the onus on developers and on local electeds to ensure that we're hitting that 100% mark. And if we're not hitting it, then we're not going to build as much office. And there won't be as many jobs and as many people won't be coming in. And so it's trying to be creative and find solutions that will, again, leverage and harness or create incentives for people to do the right thing. We have to regulate greed somehow. And so it's trying to be creative.
To learn more about the work our guests are doing, please check out the list of websites in the show description and on the last slide of our episode. Reminder, the best way to stay up to date on our work is to sign up for the newsletter at the address below. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From San Francisco, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Sometimes we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since your push to serve my shove. I'm not a violent man, but I will kill for what I